tackle today how academics can use generative AI thoughtfully and ethically. And implied by that title is the very real possibility academics will use generative AI thoughtlessly and unethically. And I have quite a complex relationship to this subject. My interest in it was motivated by an immediate awareness that in the context of accelerated academia, where academics are under pressure to increase the rate of publication, we're expected to do more with less. There's a risk those incentives would lead us to a uncritical and potentially destructive embrace of generative AI. And I started my work on this from a slightly optimistic position that the way to address this problem was not to say that we shouldn't use it, although I do respect that case, but rather to try and establish what it would look like to use it in a careful and scholarly way. And that if we could establish those norms, then we might begin to govern this adequately and find ways to use it creatively rather than destructively, to use it thoughtfully and ethically rather than the opposite. 2.5 years since ChatGPT was launched, I'm getting fairly pessimistic about that. And I'll try and offer some constructive thoughts about how it can be used as part of digital scholarship, which is a term that I take from the literature on social media use by academics, which I've also contributed to a lot over the years. But I'll also point to the gaps and tensions and damage that is already being done to the knowledge system. And I'll suggest that the choices that we make professionally within universities over the coming months are going to be really important for determining not just how this technology is integrated into universities, but I think, at risk of sounding pretentious, the future of knowledge, the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities. Because unlike social media, which was more specialized in how it could change academic practice in areas such as networking, for example, I'll argue that large language models cover pretty much every facet of academic activity. And in fact, we can see in the contemporary university, much like many other organizations, radically undergoing change, which can be hard to see at first because it's happening with discrete functions. But if we add up those changes that are underway, we are potentially liable to see some really significant transformation that I think we have reason to worry about. And in a way, this was recognized early on, but in a way, it wasn't. The debate about generative AI in higher education kicked off with the launch of ChatGPT by OpenAI in November 2022. But the preoccupation there was a recognition of its disruptive impact, to use that term idiomatically. But this was confined almost entirely to anxieties about students and assessment integrity. On the one hand, I don't want to belittle the anxieties that people have expressed about assessment integrity. Clearly, there is a real problem. But I also think there's been an inflation and a panic about these issues, driven by a kind of social media culture surrounding them and a lot of existing anxious currents within higher education practice. And while there have been real issues, a lot of the responses that have been advocated are quite short-sighted, such as calls for a return to in-person assessment, with the kind of equity and logistical issues addressed by that. And the way in which this has been framed narrowly in terms of assessment integrity obscures the need for a more fundamental rethinking of assessment practice. But I'm not going to talk about assessment practice today. I just think that's the important context for how generative AI is being received within higher education. And one of the reasons I've got frustrated with these debates about AI and assessment, despite being very active in them, is it obscures the much broader ramifications of large language models for what we, and I mean we as employees within universities and associated institutions, rather than necessarily just academics, what we do within the sector. Because they have the potential to transform virtually every aspect of the work that goes on with the sector. And I've looked particularly at scholarship, the work that contributes to bodies of knowledge, through practices such as thinking, collaborating, communicating, and engaging. And I come to this as a digital sociologist and a philosopher by training who studied and supported academics' use of emerging technologies since the early 2010s. I paid for my PhD by being an academic social media trainer and technology consultant. And so I've always been interested in theory and practice and the relationship between the two. As a sociologist, I'm interested in how systems change and what that means for the role of individuals and networks within them. But as a creative technologist, I'm interested in what we can do with this technology. And that's why I found myself oscillating in a way that I've been told can be very confusing for other people. Because as a sociologist, I increasingly feel that we're all doomed here. As a creative technologist, I'm still very excited about what LLMs can do. And what I'll talk about today is my provisional attempt to try and reconcile those two perspectives, to make space for creative practice, while also recognizing and affirming the very real risks that we're seeing rapidly develop around us. And the focal point for this is to try and find ways of working with LLMs as tools, as software, in ways that are intellectually satisfying, sustainable, and crucially aligned with our values as scholars. This can be confusing simply because the landscape of generative AI, as the kind of buzzword that organizes this hype, is very, very crowded. This is one of many infographics in circulation, which shows a dizzying array of tools and software across a whole range of categories. And it can be hard to keep up under these circumstances and to know what exactly we should do. But the reality is that there are just a few models that I think people working within academia really need to know about. These are Google's Gemini, OpenAI's ChatGPT, and Anthropic's Claude. I suspect everyone on the call will be familiar with at least one of these, mostly all three. And I think these are the ones that have the most direct practical use. They're likely to be the most influential in the long term. And for reasons we can come on to in the discussion, they're going to crowd out alternatives because these are the basic infrastructure upon which other forms of software are being built. And many academics either haven't tried generative AI or more likely briefly experimented with ChatGPT 3.5 when it was first released. And I was actually a bit of a skeptic initially at this stage. I was interested, but I was interested as much as someone who studies technological hype. The billions of investment that some of the biggest firms in the world were pushing into this meant something would happen. And I thought the initial LLMs were interesting. But it was only with ChatGPT 4 and more recently Anthropic's Claude 3 Opus that I began to become a very uncomfortable and ambivalent evangelist, that I began to see these as cultural technologies, certainly not general artificial intelligence or anything like it, but rather as machinery for working with text that was potentially radical in its implications for knowledge. And despite the fact that it only being 2.5 years, well, a bit over 2.5 years since ChatGPT was launched, the development of these models is really significant. And unless you are immersed in their everyday use, it can be difficult to see the extent to which there have been developments. And unless you're using the premium models, you're unlikely to be encountering the full capabilities of these systems. And unless you're using them in extended and immersive real-world contexts, it can be hard to see their full capabilities because they are fascinatingly general purpose in their character. And the firms themselves find it hard to say exactly what they are for, which is a kind of commercial problem that really fascinates me. The uses come from exploring and experimenting with them. But unless you have a kind of nerdy interest, as I do, in the software itself, it can be hard to motivate that, which is why we have a strange epistemic gap, I think, opening up between people who are immersed in the use of these technologies and those who are not. If you've not used them, I suggest a very easy starting point is to simply introduce yourself. And I always feel this sounds slightly facile when I describe it, but the more training I've done, the more confident I've become in this. If you find it hard to interact with an LLM, in my experience, the most likely reason for that is that you're not actually conversing with it. And this itself becomes fascinatingly problematic because to say you should converse with it implies it's an agent, implies it's an interlocutor, and it's really not, but you have to treat it like that to understand how to interact with it and to get the best, most use out of it in a kind of knowledge-intensive organization. And so if you've not tried this, I'd suggest quite literally just saying hello, saying a bit about yourself, talking about your work, talking about what you're interested in, and seeing what response you get. And as you have that kind of conversation, you can begin to share thoughts as they occur to you. And this sense of using it as a journal that can talk back is one of the most effective intellectually, but also potentially one of the most problematic environmentally uses that can be made of LLMs. This is the use that I found enormously constructive, and with the kind of educational work I'm doing, I've been very interested in how we can support other people in developing this kind of epistemic practice, where it becomes a way of recording and relating to your own thought process as you work with it. In my work on social media and blogging, I've argued that we can see those as knowledge infrastructure in a similar way. They're ways of relating to work in progress, and they provide ways of sharing that with others. It's just in this case, the other is a artificial intelligence software, a large language model. And a potential model for how to see thinking with generative AI comes from programming. Software developers often talk about rubber ducking as a practice, where they place a rubber duck on top of their monitor. And when they have a problem, particularly with debugging, so trying to understand why something hasn't worked, they will describe the problem out loud to the rubber duck. They will articulate the problem, and in doing so, often find that they can find some resolution to it. To state verbally, to make the tacit explicit, and to articulate it can often change how we relate to a problem. And I'm suggesting effectively that we can treat LLMs as a general purpose rubber duck. But what makes it so enticing and engaging and often creatively fulfilling is that the rubber duck can talk back. So you get the value of articulating the problem, you get the clarity that comes from stepping back and getting detachment from what you're trying to get into words. But it also talks back to you, and that can in turn compel and generate more ideas, which can then be clarified using this mechanism. This, I would argue, amongst people who are using LLMs regularly in academia is becoming a common practice, even if they might not articulate it in quite this way. And we can see it as using them as interlocutors rather than tools. To not see them as effectively research assistants that we outsource tasks we don't want to, and simply give the LLM an instruction, but rather things we talk to in a kind of open-ended and dialogical way. Not, I should state, obviously a replacement for human interlocutors, but a supplement to them. Ones you can have different kinds of conversations with a different kind of dynamic. They can offer feedback and pose questions to refine arguments and identify arenas for future exploration. And by engaging with them, it's possible to maintain a steady flow of ideas and keep connections forming, even if writing might be slightly intermittent. Another way to think about this is in terms of how it can feed into collaboration processes. Collaboration is a big part of how I work, but my experience has often been that we lose valuable insights from meetings as they fade from memory. You can feel after a discussion that you're collectively on the cusp of a breakthrough, but actually then you come back to the same people a week or two later, and suddenly that sense of energy is gone. And I'm very interested in how we can use LLMs as a kind of digital scribe, which can help capture conversations, analyze them, and transform them into searchable knowledge. Most people in universities that use Microsoft Teams have probably experienced this now. And I have my reservations about this, both because the habitual use of that transcription often leaves things getting recorded that we would rather not be recorded, and the politics of what gets recorded and archived and how it circulates in higher education is becoming even more complex as a result of this. But when it's a deliberate, purposeful practice, it can be really valuable. In collaborative writing, this is the place that I found this most valuable. When I'm working with co-authors, we record the meeting just as a one-to-one Zoom. We transcribe it, and then we feed it into a conversational thread in Anthropic's Claude. It doesn't just record our meeting and keep ideas alive. We actually ask Claude to respond to what we've been talking about, to suggest questions and provocations for our next conversation. And when it's done in a purposeful, deliberate way, when everyone is fully participating in it, it can be exceptionally powerful, and you can build up a kind of working archive of the ideas that move between meetings, connect them together, and keep ideas in motion. Crucially, you have to be explicit with colleagues about how and why you're using these tools. I have quite recently had a private conversation automatically circulated to everyone who was in a meeting because we forgot that it was still transcribing. This is something that, unless we're careful, will become quite a common experience. And I think we need to recognize that there are real risks in getting into a situation where we record every meeting as default, and the way that will exercise power and the kind of agenda setting that would be possible by what gets summarized, what gets captured, and what doesn't is something we have to be very sensitive to. So I think this has to be treated very, very carefully. I saw an interview with the CEO of Otter AI, a transcription company recently, and he was describing how he was able to search the meetings that had taken place in the organization every week and how useful that was to him. And I was struck that he didn't think that was at all creepy for the people working in the organization. He didn't see that as something that they might find uncomfortable or imagine that their practice in meetings might be changed by the fact the CEO could do a text search of what the meetings were about. We have to be really careful about this in organizations, and I wanted to stress that. But as a collaborative practice, as something that can support small-scale collaborative relations, this is really powerful, and it's transformed how myself and colleagues and friends work together because it opens up iterative approaches that create possibilities for more ambitious collaborative projects. And it helps ensure that knowledge becomes persistent rather than ephemeral, and the kind of engagement that comes with knowledge. The third cluster of suggestions comes with relation to communication. In and beyond higher education, there's a great deal of anxiety surrounding the quantity and the quality of email communication, which has sometimes been described as a deep, affective, somatic crisis that threatens to overwhelm us. And conversational agents can help with this. They can draft, they can review, they can adapt communication to different audiences and different contexts without taking over your authentic voice. This has to be treated very carefully. I lead, well, at least until next Friday when I finish it, which I'm very happy about. But for now, I lead a large postgraduate program with a mainly international student group. And I found this invaluable for improving my communication with them. If you're sending a mass message with a lot of detail to an audience almost entirely using English as a second language, the quality of the communication makes a big difference to the effectiveness of the outcome. And there are things like the use of idiom, for example, where I've really improved in how I communicate via email through writing these emails and reflecting on them with LLMs. Because while, for example, I knew that I should avoid idiom, I did not understand everything that was idiom. There are things I just did not realize were idiom, so I didn't know to exclude them from email. And so if you use them in a reflective way, the LLM doesn't stand in for your own communication. It supports it. It's almost like it can be a communications coach that you work with to get better at writing and better at interaction. And you can refine as well as maintain your personal style and tone. And I think at its best, it can turn communication from a draining burden into an opportunity for improving how we connect with colleagues and students. The risk is that it reduces human interaction. And I think this popular cartoon that circulated quite widely summarizes what is a very real possibility. And we need to be very careful about how we relate to this technology. And this is another example of what I'll come on to shortly, which is how LLMs provide solutions to short-term problems. Sometimes they provide solutions that are ameliorative and actually help us learn to better negotiate the problem in the future. Sometimes they involve outsourcing, where it solves the short-term problem, but at the cost of our own practice, and we might gradually lose the capacity to do it ourselves. But in both cases, those individual problem-solving actions can lead to cumulative consequences with important implications for organizations and our professional culture. And we see evidence of this in many places, unfortunately. Where, for example, in scholarly publishing, we have increasing evidence of the use of ChatGPT in particular, figuring in publications that have successfully made their way through peer review, often in predatory journals or kind of gray zone journals, but not exclusively. And there are many ways we could respond to this. One quite tempting one would be to suggest that generative AI is breaking scholarly publishing. But for anyone who studies the history of scholarly publishing, particularly the recent history, our knowledge system was already creaking at the seams for all sorts of structural reasons to begin with. And so while generative AI is clearly producing problems, I would suggest at root it's a mirror that reflects the incentives and penalties that higher education offers those working within it. And it's a vector that amplifies the existing problems rather than creates them. But it's still worth stopping and, kind of dwelling on the fact things are getting through peer review that have prompts left in them, that have phrases like, as of my last knowledge update, that ChatGPT have produced, getting through them. The fact this is happening in at such a demonstrable scale is really worrying. And it also raises the question of, well, ultimately, this is incompetent use of LLMs for academic malpractice. What about competent malpractice? What about people who are using these in ways that are not immediately obvious? Empirically, how we study that, I think, is a fascinatingly complex question. But for those of us interested in meta science, I think we urgently need to study that question. We need to find ways of understanding the scale of this activity. And we need to have collective conversations about it, which includes recognizing the temptations of doing this. I feel I've stepped back from the brink a couple of times. I found myself late for a deadline, tired, stressed through teaching and admin, and realizing that I could use Claude to finish the paper in an afternoon, and then it would be off my desk. And I have come very close to doing it on those two occasions. And the fact I decided not to felt like it was a line in the sand, that it was establishing an ethical groundwork. But I fully understand the temptation, and I think we have to be able to have a conversation about what constitutes malpractice and what is the gray zone where it's not quite malpractice, but it's clearly something that we should be very cautious about, and to recognize the systemic temptations and to begin to understand what we can do about them. Because we are at present at a crucial stage. The AI innovator John McCarthy once said that as soon as it works, no one calls it AI anymore. And I thought about this a lot recently, about how the technology that we rely on, as we rely on it, tends to fade into the background over time. The philosophy and sociology of technology is a very broad and diverse field. But arguably, one of the few things we all agree on is that we notice infrastructure when it's new and when it's broken. And at the moment, generative AI is new, and we can point to this, and it's spectacular, and it becomes something we can have conversations about. But what happens as it becomes more familiar? What happens as it becomes routine? What happens as it fades into the background? I'm taking part in my university's Copilot 365 trial at the moment. And it's been interesting to see, firstly, how bad Copilot is compared to, say, ChatGPT and Claude. But I also think the strategy is dangerous. It is outright dangerous because designing generative AI into the fabric of our software encourages outsourcing. It encourages us to press buttons to automate processes. Whereas I would still defend prompting as an intellectual exercise because to prompt well necessitates clarity about what you're trying to do. We are, when we prompt with an LLM, ultimately writing. We are writing at the LLM and we are getting writing in return. And the more careful, the more expansive, the more sophisticated that writing is, the more value we get out of the LLM. And this process of designing generative AI functionality into Office software has the potential to be very dangerous. Because think about something like a search. Well, we might notice it now because generative AI is degrading search results, but that's another story. But think about search engines until recently. If you want to find something out, you would rarely think, I'm going to use Google search. You would just do it. The more habitual it becomes, the less it is an object of reflection. And my concern is the same thing is going to happen with generative AI. A spell checker is another example. I've been very disturbed to realize over time how much my spelling is degraded. Unless I have a red squiggly line underneath it, I can't spell a word like bureaucracy. I'm not sure I ever could, but I really can't spell it now. And ultimately, that doesn't bother me because that red line is reliably there. But it also is isolated to a particular thing. But if that same process of the degrading of our capacities becomes habitual with thinking, that is very, very dangerous. If I could no longer think adequately unless the software is there supporting me, then I think we would need to be very worried about that. I certainly would be. And while talking about the collective degrading of thinking might sound cataclysmic, I do honestly think this potential is there, which does not mean it will be realized, but we have to think very carefully about the risk. Because at present, we're still in what we might call the visible phase of generative AI, where we can notice and discuss its capabilities and limitations. And this is, I think, a window of opportunity where we can have professional conversations about how we should use it, how we shouldn't use it, and particularly the infrastructural dimensions of it, and the decisions we should make about what we should encourage and what we should discourage. Whether we should accept something like Copilot 365, the fact it's not very useful at the moment is kind of weirdly reassuring because I'm struggling to see how anyone could actually use it for anything. But if that becomes a mainstream practice, that could be destructive, and we need to think about that. The other aspect is LLMs on mobile devices. The evidence we have about the rise of ChatGPT on mobile, for example, and the popularity of DeepSeek on smartphones. We relate to smartphones in slightly different ways to desktops and laptops. We relate to them in more habitual ways. They're slightly more intimate devices. And I suspect the more we get used to using this stuff on mobiles and possibly tablets as well, the less we're likely to think about it. And so the risk is this fades into the background. It becomes like the water that we swim in. And the more we're swimming in the water, the less likely we are to step back and ask questions of that water and what it means to be there. And this is a problem because as much as this technology can be used in creatively enriching, intellectually stimulating ways, it is also very brittle, and it is brittle in a quite unpredictable manner. There are epistemic dilemmas inherent in its use. What's usually called hallucination, but I don't think it's a very helpful term, refers to the fact these predictive systems will generate plausible but factually incorrect information. They don't have a model of the world. They simply have a statistical mode of producing a likely output to match your input. And this means that they will tend to say things that are just wrong, but often plausible. And the problem is that unless we're a domain expert and we're actually applying that domain expertise to review the output, we can't tell when they're wrong. And a system that is always going to be wrong sometimes, but is difficult to predict when and how it will be wrong, is rather dangerous. They're also prone to perpetuating widely held but inaccurate beliefs, in the process blurring the line between truth and popular opinion. Because they don't have a world model. They don't have a database of facts. They're not a database. They're not something we can use to factually search. They're a statistical model of an enormous corpus of text. And they are also, as it's often called, black boxes. This is changing slightly, and my summer project is to get my head around the computer science of this because the techniques being invented to effectively look inside the LLM and to see how it reasons are absolutely fascinating, but at present I can only grasp about a third of the papers that I'm reading. So I don't want to comment on that, but just to point out that we are starting to open that black box. But these hallucinations can have real world consequences. From researchers who found that an AI-powered transcription tool used in hospitals is inventing things no one ever said, which when we're talking about medical records has the potential to be cataclysmic. A lawyer has had to apologize for fake court citations produced by ChatGPT. Lawsuits are rising because customers have been misled by airline chatbots. So it's not just these systems being wrong, but as they become embedded in organizational processes and as perhaps they fade into the background as infrastructure, the incidences in which they're wrong can be deeply significant. And while I thought this was a real issue, I was confident this was getting better over time. while we should be cautious about the data these firms produce about their own accuracy, because it's very contested and a lot of commercial value is tied up in reporting on it, there was solid grounds to think hallucination rates were diminishing with time, that hallucination was inherent in the technology, but there were lots of ad hoc workarounds and techniques that were being used to reduce the hallucination rate through how the models were trained or post-trained. Unfortunately, we've got very worrying data actually from OpenAI themselves, which I think is interesting, showing that the latest models, the most powerful models, which are reasoning models, which is a distinction we can come on to in the questions if anyone's interested, actually in some domains hallucinate at double the rate of previous models. On a test of factual questions about people, the O4 mini model that was found to hallucinate 48% of the time. I don't think we should ever be asking factual questions of LLMs because that fundamentally misunderstands what they are. But lots of people do ask these factual questions. And if you're doing that, a model hallucinating 48% of the time is pretty damn worrying. And the idea we could ever rely on that is open for question. When it comes to non-reasoning models and aspects such as summarizing documents, the hallucination rate is much lower, so 4.4% and 1.5%. And there are methodological and commercial challenges to comprehensive comparison. Methodologically, how we compare hallucinations, I think, is a really complex issue. And a lot of this debate seems to rest on a positivism that I find quite problematic, because how we prompt the system influences the propensity of hallucination. One driver of hallucination is when we don't give enough information about what we want. And these systems are, so to speak, trained to please. When we don't provide enough detail and context, it's more likely the system will imagine something to fill in the blanks. So not all prompts are created equally. And the more carefully you prompt and the more carefully you reflect, the less likely you are to get hallucinations and the less damaging they will be if you do get them. But it's still worrying. And the possibility this reduction in the rate of hallucination is reversing is very, very real. So that's just the epistemic dilemmas if we rely on them as sources of knowledge. The ethical dilemmas are also huge and consequential. The most widely discussed one is the environmental impact of AI, the kind of machinery of data centers being rapidly constructed around the world, and the energy intensivity, both of training the models, but also operating them day to day. I fully share this concern, and I think it's hugely significant, but I think we have to see this in terms of platform capitalism as a whole. To isolate one aspect of the digital economy as uniquely problematic, I think leaves us with a misleading picture of how carbon emissions and ecological impact is increasingly driven by digital technology, which until recently was widely imagined to be weightless, as in the notion of the cloud. And so this is a continuation of an existing problem rather than a new one. And I think it's important that we see it in those terms to place it in a historical context. The use of generative AI also raises questions about intellectual property rights and the ownership of AI-generated content. We have lots of evidence of these systems being trained on copyrighted material without permission. Facebook's Llama model was recently found to be trained on LibGen, a huge archive of pirated books. The Atlantic magazine actually has a search form where you can look to see if your work has been included in the archive. I have 8 publications it's been trained on. In no case have I given any copyright or my publisher given any copyright permission for it. And it's interesting to see this in context and to think about what that means for our work going forward. In terms of labor and employment, this is the one that worries me the most, at least in the short term. The potential for these technologies to automate certain tasks and displace human workers. And I think we often imagine automation to be a wholesale replacement of humans with automated systems. And I think what we are already seeing is a reorganization of work, where unbundled roles will be divided up into those maintained by a human worker and those maintained by an automated system. And I don't think, say, in universities, we're likely to see a fully automated university, or at any point really, certainly not any point soon. But the pressure on academic and professional staff within universities, the quantity and quality of human interaction in universities at a time of financial crisis, I think all these things could precipitously drop in the near future. And generative AI could be a real mechanism driving that drop in a way that would make unhappy institutions even more unhappy. Another huge issue is how these systems can perpetuate and amplify biases present in the training data and the real world social consequences of this. This is my favorite example of this problem, where I asked ChatGPT, draw me an image of a successful doctor, a successful academic, a successful lawyer, and a successful writer. In all cases, it drew pictures of men. And what I found hilarious, but also very worrying about this, is that they're all the same man. I mean, if anyone's seen Suits, the TV show, it immediately made me think kind of Harvey Specter from Suits. And it's a conventionally attractive professional man, professional white man, in his early mid 30s. Of course, the reason it's done that is not because it's been designed in a way that intentionally embodies that prejudice, but rather we live in a culture dominated by a particular image of what success looks like, what professionalism looks like. And so it's again a mirror to the world we've created. But as these tools become infrastructural, as they become widespread and habitually used, that mirror can then feed those pressures back into the real world and amplify them. In the defense of ChatGPT, I've not been able to get it to recreate this. I did this in March 2024, and by the summer of 2024, when I tried to get it to do it again, there has been some sort of fix. So I suspect this has been manually coded to introduce gender equity into representations. So they are getting better, but the fundamental problem here, I think, is the culture we've created. And so the question is not the misogyny or racism of the model, but rather how the models reflect the prejudices that exist in society and could serve to amplify them over time. And so to draw to a close, I feel honestly a little bit embarrassed that I've written a book talking about how we can creatively use generative AI, because I do feel its use is increasingly bound up in very problematic processes. But my intuition that led me to the project in the first place was that simply saying don't do it is not going to stop people from using it. And to have a conversation about what responsible practice looks like still serves a purpose, even if I am in the process of trying to cut back my use of it and use it in very specific, isolated ways. And this is particularly important when we think about those of us who teach as well, because as educators, we have a responsibility to model thoughtful practice for our students. And I think this involves recognizing what the technology can and can't do, the limitations and capacities, but also to kind of overcome some of the polarization. In the last few weeks, I have multiple times been told I am too critical of generative AI and also that I'm not critical enough, which does make me think that maybe I'm doing something right if, kind of both sides of this debate are frustrated with me. But I think this polarized debate makes it hard to talk about practice. It makes it hard to talk about what we do, not in the world we want there to be, which I do think we should be thinking about and working towards, but in the organizations we actually confront with the practical challenges that we face every day. When we've done critique, we still have to get up and confront a fundamentally broken university system and make compromise decisions within it. And I think that level of reflective practice is one that I have felt gets lost far too easily. And recognizing how difficult these decisions are and how hard it is to sustain ethical practice shouldn't make us lose sight of the long-term impacts of the technology. I think it's crucial that we keep that perspective, but we also have to deal with the situation that we're in, and particularly how, at least in the UK university sector, there's a huge financial crisis underway, potentially 10,000 job losses coming on top of those already underway. And it's that context that really worries me. I think this technology is likely to prove very destructive, but I think that's the interaction between the university system it's being taken up in and the technology itself. I don't think responsible practice can solve those problems, but I think responsible practice, if we're going to use the LLM, is the bare minimum we can expect of ourselves, and it could be a foundation for something else, and something deeper and something better. And so to try and end on a slightly more positive note, I wanted to suggest 5 broad strategies. So if you're going to be using LLMs as an academic, here are 5 techniques to think and principles to think about your use. The first is approach it as an interlocutor, not just as a tool, to try and use it as something to think with rather than a substitute for thought. To recognize you're going to have to experiment and you're going to have to reflect on what works. And that means being clear about what you're trying to do and maybe be willing to revise that expectation over time. To be explicit about your intentions and the context, because good prompting requires both. And I do maintain the claim that there is an intellectual art form to prompting. It is a very interesting intellectual exercise. I think prompt engineering, apart from very specialized contexts for development, is an over-exaggerated pseudoscientific notion. I think prompting is a literary practice. It's a form of writing. It is a form of writing that opens up certain ways of working with these systems. And I find it fascinating. My sense of training academics is prompting does not come naturally to academics, and I think that's very interesting. Fourth, consider the ethical implications of your practice. These cannot be seen as neutral tools. The use of them involves consequences, and it leaves us tied in to broader systems and processes of transformation. And I think if we're going to use them, we have to be aware of that. And finally, to try and preserve scholarly judgment and voice, and to remember what makes academic work valuable, the expertise, the creativity, the judgment that shape it, and how we can use generative AI in a way that supplements rather than replaces these qualities. So hopefully I've given a balanced view of the real consequences and the risks tied up in this use, but also the possibility and the imperative to have a reflective approach to it. It's equally possible that I've done exactly the oscillation I referred to at the start and had a section that sounded really enthusiastic and had a section that sounded really catastrophic. Hopefully, even if that's the case, I've given you stuff to think about that's useful going forward. And I'd be really interested to hear any questions or comments. Thank you, everyone.